And that brings back my memory of, you see, the Irish Prime Minister, when COVID was, very much present, um, he announced on television that the science now had fully confirmed that the vaccination was safe for children as young as 5 years old. And that would have been because he was talking about the science, a consensus. All the experts were now saying this, but they weren't all saying that. There was experts who weren't saying that, but they were censored. And I was struck by also, because it's not that he's not a good person. These people are, in many cases, overworked and trying to do the best they can. However, it was clear to me he didn't understand what the science means. In other words, how could science be already after proving the vaccination was safe for 5-year-old children when it'll be years before the data is available to show whether it is or wasn't? So that would be a statement then that he made, that if Einstein was listening in his grave and saw what that was now being described as science, he would have turned in his grave, literally, but this is what was happening. And none of the journalists were picking up on that or questioning that. You see, I was amazed.
Well, I think that's a really good example, because in the case of a new pharmaceutical product, and I'm not wanting to take sides particularly, but there are no experts. There can't be any experts on the long-term safety profile of a new pharmaceutical product, because everyone's equally ignorant, and there has to be what I call epistemic humility. We've got to be humble, and as you say, people like Einstein would presumably have been very humble and appalled at the idea that there can be certainty in them, that we can know these things. So that's exactly what I mean by tribal truth, which I think has now become official truth, which is the kind of consensus of the great and good of our tribe, and it leads to censorship. Inevitably, it leads to the idea, well, if we're good and we're motivated by high ethical, political motives, we all want to make the world a better place, and if we know we're right, then these other people coming along who are spreading doubt, well, they become heretics, and they've got to be silenced. This is another thing I think that's worth saying. I think the boomers, when they were young, they were very, very kind of excited, carried away by this kind of revolution they were waging. They felt they were discovering things that their parents and grandparents didn't know and couldn't experience. What they were rediscovering was a kind of pre-Victorian, pre-Enlightenment way of knowing, this kind of tribal way of knowing. So there were people at the time in the late 60s and 70s who were warning that they were staring. They kind of called the boomers, perhaps somewhat unkindly, barbarians, and said this is like the destruction of civilization. All the restraints on human nature and all the restraints on tribalism that have been built up over centuries in Western liberal societies. People wrote at the time that the baby boomers were tearing all this down and it would have disastrous consequences. Yeah,
and just on that subject, which I suppose you used the word there, creative humility, I think. Well, you certainly used the word humility, but in your book, just one part of it here, what you mention is,
I think I called it epistemic humility. It's the humility that we don't have certain knowledge. We can't. We're human. We're all fallible. And if I think that was the Enlightenment, and that was the Victorian liberalism that was the scientific method that is science, to be humble about knowledge.
Yeah, in your book, you write that Louis Heron, foreign correspondent of the Times, what he wrote was that recognizing one's own ignorance was the essential first step to producing honest, mature journalism. So that would have been a challenge, I suppose, very much to decide that's emerged.
Yeah, and I think that was one of the assumptions of Victorian liberal journalism, that journalists don't actually know very much, and that there was a kind of responsibility for audiences to understand that too. You know, there was no reason to think that just because it's in the newspaper, it's true. But when was the last time you heard anyone say that on the news, Eddie? You know, you cross over to a correspondent somewhere on TV news, and they say, you know, what's happening and why is it happening? And they're very confident and they're delivering the lines. It's theatre. When was the last time anyone said on TV, I don't know. I don't know what's going on. No one knows what's going on, but here are some facts and here are some opinions. We don't tend to get that. Perhaps it doesn't sell very well. Perhaps it's not kind of commercial.
And the other aspect of that, Graham, too, is that I noticed often on the news, comment is made, say, for example, Ukraine bombed a residential area of Russia deliberately, but they're saying that like they know it as a fact, but it may have come from some Russian source, or much more likely, which has been reported, Russia has deliberately bombed such and such a residential area. And that's apparently the source of that information is coming from the Ukraine side. So instead of an incredibly important boundary, which is it has been reported to us. Once somebody says it is a fact, there's no boundary. But if they say, if I say, Graham has reported this to me, I'm not then arrogantly claiming it's a fact because I don't know.
Yeah, well, that's kind of back to the beginning. I think that's exactly why I say that I argue that journalism is broken. There's something wrong with journalism, and what we get on the mainstream news, what I call official journalism, is this series of narratives. So you mentioned Russia, Ukraine. So the dominant narrative on official journalism, and I'm not saying if it's true or not. I'm just describing what I see. That the narrative is, Russia are bad and Ukraine good. And once you've got that narrative, you then get narrative-led news, which means that the journalism only reports facts. They may be accurate facts, but they only report facts that confirm the narrative. Other facts which are inconvenient and might contradict it are ignored or suppressed or downplayed. There's a whole new industry now, over the last 10, 15 years that's grown up, which I call unofficial journalism. Your podcast, your media that you're making right now, Eddie, would probably be in that category. Anyone who questions or provides the other side of the argument, that is excluded from the mainstream. There's plenty of it around online. It's been made possible by the internet. So it's there for people to see, but it's completely different. And we've got these two completely different worlds. There's the, official journalism with its official facts and official narratives, and there's unofficial journalism online with unofficial facts, unofficial narratives. And yeah, we're kind of in a bit of a mess.
And an example of that too would be, because I just want to read a quote from your book as well. And preceding reading the quote, I just want to mention that recently I saw President Biden being interviewed or giving a speech, and he very recently, and he said that very graphically that Russia were totally responsible for the war in Ukraine. The word is totally responsible. But the thing is that one of the things that's really, really gone wrong is when the context of something is being ignored completely, and the focus is just on a specific event. So, but to come straight into what you're saying about alternative voices to what President Biden stated, in one of those alternative voices is Professor John Marshminer, who's very well renowned, would have been on all the mainstream media up to the time he suddenly had said the following, in contrast to what the narrative is about Ukraine. And as you're saying, pointed out there, all I'm aware of is certain facts which I wouldn't have been aware of so much if I hadn't organized that particular thinking center event on Ukraine. And there are verifiable facts. But in any case, from your book, and it might be just interesting to write this out or read this out, Marshminer said, those who believe in facts and logic will quickly discover that the United States and its allies are mainly responsible for this train wreck, meaning the Ukraine war. The tragic truth is that if the West had not pursued NATO expansion into Ukraine, it is unlikely there would be a war in Ukraine today. Washington played the central role in leading Ukraine down the path to destruction. History will judge the United States and its allies with abundant harshness for its remarkable foolish policy on Ukraine. And of course, I'm not necessarily saying that I agree with every aspect of that, but what I do agree with, that something even more central to what he said there, a fact that's even more important. Once he started saying something that was in opposition to the narrative that the American people were hearing and the Western world at large, he was censored from all American mainstream media. Neither has somebody like him being interviewed in Ireland, which I think is quite extraordinary. And the other professor that's also saying similar thing is Jeffrey Sachs, who's also an extremely well-respected professor of international relations. The one thing we can say, where we can't just say that it's a fact what Biden says, or it's a total fact what Marshminer says. What we can say is a total fact that Marshminer has been censored, and so have others. That's a fact.
Yeah, and it's probably worth pointing out, Eddie, that what we're dealing with when we talk about, what the cause of international conflict or a cause of a war is, what we're talking about an opinion, and I think opinions can't be true or false or right or wrong, and it's this is one of the unintended consequences of the changes that the boomers made and the type of journalism we have. Instead of distinguishing between facts, which are true or false, and opinions, which, there are simply different opinions, some of which are more valid than others, and we can accept and reject. It's our right, to kind of believe what we want to believe, I guess. But yeah, that distinction between fact and opinion has really been lost and been replaced by narrative. There are just kind of ethical political narratives. So it's good to believe, certain narratives, and bad to believe the other one. And people who believe the wrong narrative, they're bad people and spreaders of misinformation and hate, and they should be censored. It feels like we're just kind of walking down a road, down a hill, which is not leading anywhere good.
And also, you see, one of the things I feel as well, when there's that type of polarization from, like, for example, what takes place in the political reality of the United States, the Republicans and the Democrats, and of course the same dynamic takes place elsewhere, which means then, once you lock into that tribal way of thinking, as you're saying, then the other side, or always 100% responsible for what's happening. But the problem that creates is that responsibility for what's happening then isn't fairly carried by the players who are contributing to the problem. And I'm always intrigued, one of the most extraordinary stories in the Bible, the wisdom that's often there, and I'm not a practicing Catholic. You see, when Jesus says, when they're going to stone the prostitute, let he who is without sin throw the first stone. So it's almost like pointing at something that and apparently I was told by Patrick de Mare, who was one of the pioneers of the new form of dialogue that is of great interest to me. He said that Jesus also said, carry your cross, the burden is light. In other words, if everybody carries their share of the responsibility, these things will get resolved. As long as all the responsibility is lopsided put on one side, and the other side, which owns also a big section of the responsibility, doesn't acknowledge that, the cross becomes lopsided.
Yeah, it's interesting you refer to religion, actually, because if we look historically at this, what I call Victorian liberal journalism, and which came out of the European or Anglo-American Enlightenment, the Western Enlightenment, whatever you want to call it. What came before that, and why did people turn to kind of debate and reason and being tolerant of each other? Well, because what came before that in the 16th and 17th centuries were terrible religious wars in Europe, between Protestants and Catholics and rival Protestant sects and so on. And people were burning each other because they were part of the wrong tribe. And this was horrific. And I think in many ways, sadly, it's the default condition of human beings to revert. I think we revert very quickly to these tribal settings where they're hardwired into us. We've evolved that way over millions of years, hundreds of thousands of years, to be tribal. It's a pretty tough, unpleasant reality to confront, but I think that is the truth. And so the Victorians and the people during the 18th century tried to think, well, is there a better way? Can we stop this? Can we restrain it? And they felt that the way was through things like individual liberty of conscience, respect for the individual belief, allow people to believe what they want to believe, and toleration. I'll tolerate you on condition that you tolerate me. We don't have to agree. We don't have to like each other, but we can kind of get along perhaps as neighbors. And going back to the journalism, the key thing that you need is truth. You need the truth, and you need different opinions to be tested. It's only when you go down the road of censorship and intolerance, and you believe that you're morally good, and the other people, the other tribe, are morally bad. People who are different and disagree, they're morally bad. That's when you set out on this road to kind of darkness. And as I say, the boomers, I think, innocently and well-meaningly thought they were discovering something amazing. What they were doing, they were rediscovering these old tribal settings that their parents and grandparents had tried to restrain.
Yes, and another dynamic too that occurs, there was a very prominent Irish journalist, and he was also a television journalist, and he then was very strongly opposing what was taking place in Ireland, in other words. But then he becomes very extreme. So now lately I heard him say, when he described the people that are running the country, he described them as scumbags, which means then that he is not aware that that's self-sabotage, because they're not scumbags. And by him saying that, he prevents the possibility of having any sort of dialogue with those people, which means he censors himself from discovering that they're not scumbags. So it's a polarization that tends to occur in that manner, I think, as well. So sometimes people who pretend to be on one side are actually doing more harm. And Graham, just by the way, I heard you recently on another interview, and going back to what you're also talking about, this tendency to encourage people not to think for themselves and believe the trust authority. That extraordinary thing you read out that had occurred in Nazi Germany. It'd be helpful, I think you could.
Yeah, well, I think the context of that was censorship, because we seem to be living in an age of rapidly growing censorship. I mean, I believe in freedom of expression, and as much freedom of speech as is, reasonably possible.